When the 80s turned to the supernatural, horror went all in on the weird. Demons, ancient curses, psychic powers, and gateways to hell. No idea was too wild, no visual too over the top. These were the years when filmmakers mixed mysticism with metal, blending Gothic atmosphere, creature effects, and neon fantasy into something only the 80s could create. Some of these movies came from major studios, others from the midnight movie underground. But they all shared that unmistakable energy. Loud, imaginative, and unafraid to be strange. Tonight, we're summoning 10 supernatural horror movies from the 80s that prove when the lights went down and the tracking lines rolled, anything could happen. The Gate, 1987. For a generation of horror fans, The Gate was that movie you accidentally saw too young and never forgot. Released in 1987, it came from director Tibor Takacs, who somehow turned a kids in peril story into one of the most imaginative supernatural horrors of the decade. Stephen Dorff, barely in his teens, plays Glenn, a suburban kid who discovers a geode in his backyard after a lightning storm. When he and his best friend crack it open and play a heavy metal record backward, as you did in the 80s, they unknowingly recite an incantation that opens a literal portal to hell. What crawls out isn't one monster, but an army of tiny clay-animated demons that overrun the house, tearing reality apart, one hallucination at a time. The film's effects team relied entirely on practical tricks. The minions were full-sized actors in suits, filmed on miniature sets with forced perspective, the kind of low-budget genius that defined the VHS era. There's stop-motion, matte work, and optical effects that feel tactile even today. Takacs balances childhood adventure and pure nightmare. It's got echoes of Poltergeist and Gremlins, but it feels smaller, more dangerous, like something you weren't supposed to rent. When it hit video, it became a rite of passage, the perfect sleepover horror film. You'd put it on expecting silly demons and end up hiding behind a pillow. A sequel, The Gate 2, Trespassers, arrived a few years later but never recaptured the same lightning. The original remains one of the most creative kids versus the supernatural movies of its era. Imaginative, eerie, and somehow still charming, even as it conjures up the apocalypse. Warlock, 1989. By the late 80s, horror was crowded with masked killers and low-budget sequels. Then Warlock arrived in 1989 and did something different. It turned the genre into a supernatural chase across time. Directed by Steve Miner, who'd already cut his teeth on Friday the 13th Part 2 in House, the movie blends fantasy, horror, and dark humor into a film that plays like the Terminator with black magic. Julian Sands stars as a 17th-century sorcerer condemned to death, only to escape by hurtling through a time portal into modern-day Los Angeles. His pursuer, a grim witch hunter named Red Fern, played by Richard E. Grant, follows close behind, confused by traffic lights and blenders, but dead set on stopping him. Their conflict revolves around the Grand Grimoire, a book said to contain the secret name of God, which, when spoken backward, can unmake creation itself. Sands' performance is what makes Warlock unforgettable. He gives the villain an elegance that contrasts beautifully with the absurdity of his surroundings. One moment he's slicing a weather vane in half with a spell. The next he's flying over the desert like a demonic Peter Pan. Composer Jerry Goldsmith's score alternates between gothic menace and playful mischief, capturing that strange tone perfectly. The film was a modest success in theaters but exploded on VHS, where its cover art, the Warlock striding through flames, promised more sorcery than most fantasy movies delivered. It spawned 2 sequels, but the original remains the real gem. An inventive, fast-paced piece of supernatural pulp that reminded horror fans there were still new kinds of monsters to chase. The Sender, 1982. The Sender is one of those horror films that feels like it slipped through the cracks of the decade. It's elegant, moody, and surprisingly restrained. A supernatural story built on psychology and dread rather than blood. Directed by Roger Christian, who previously worked as a set decorator on Star Wars and Alien, the film takes the concept of psychic horror and turns it into something deeply unsettling. It opens with a quiet young man who walks fully clothed into a lake, trying to drown himself. He survives, but when he wakes up in a psychiatric hospital, he can't remember who he is. The staff call him John Doe number 83. Soon, strange things start happening. Objects move, people see visions, and violent hallucinations spread through the hospital like a virus. The twist: these aren't shared delusions. They're projections from the young man's mind. His nightmares don't just haunt him, they invade everyone around him. Catherine Harold plays the doctor, who tries to help him, while Zeljko Ivanek gives a haunting performance as the patient, quiet, fragile, and terrifying when his subconscious slips loose. The film's dream sequences, crafted through practical in-camera effects and slow motion, create a floating, hypnotic tone that feels closer to Don't Look Now or Carrie than typical 80s horror. Though The Sender was barely released in theaters, it found a second life on television and video. Filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Guillermo del Toro have since praised it as one of the most overlooked horror films of the era. It's the rare supernatural movie that doesn't need monsters or gore to get under your skin. The Sender works through suggestion, showing how fear itself can be contagious. It's quiet, confident, and eerie in a way that sticks with you long after the credits fade, like waking up from a dream you're not sure ever ended. Prince of Darkness, 1987. By the late 1980s, John Carpenter had already given us Halloween, The Thing, and Escape from New York. But in 1987, he took a quieter, stranger route with Prince of Darkness, a film that feels like the world ending in slow motion, inside a crumbling Los Angeles church. The story begins when a priest discovers a sealed cylinder hidden beneath the building. Inside is a swirling green fluid that seems to defy science. A team of graduate students and scientists is brought in to study it, but as the liquid begins to seep into their world, reality itself starts to decay. Dreams become messages from the future. Possession spreads like infection. What they're confronting might not be the devil, but the physical embodiment of evil itself, a concept older than religion, buried beneath mathematics and physics. Donald Pleasance returns from Halloween, this time as a priest trying to rationalize faith against the impossible. Victor Wong and Dennis Dunn, fresh off Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China, anchor the scientific side, and Alice Cooper appears as one of the church's possessed wanderers, a role inspired by his stage persona. Carpenter composed the score himself, a minimalist synth pulse that mirrors the film's sense of unstoppable dread. Though critics dismissed it at release, Prince of Darkness thrived on video shelves, becoming a favorite for late-night renters who wanted something deeper than slasher fare. It's a movie about the end of reason, where science meets faith and both lose. Few horror films capture that creeping sense that humanity was never meant to understand what's really out there. The Keep, 1983. There's nothing quite like The Keep. Directed by Michael Mann in 1983, yes, the same man who'd later make Heat, this film feels like a Gothic dream trapped inside a World War II movie. Based on F. Paul Wilson's novel, it tells the story of a Nazi platoon that occupies a massive stone fortress in the Carpathian Mountains, only to awaken something ancient sealed within its walls. The entity, Molasar, isn't a traditional movie monster. It's a luminous, shape-shifting presence, sometimes protector, sometimes destroyer. As soldiers start dying, a mysterious stranger, played by Scott Glenn, arrives to stop what's been unleashed. The result is half horror, half metaphysical allegory, a collision of myth, religion, and existential dread. Visually, The Keep is staggering. Man fills it with fog, shafts of light, and impossible architecture that looks more dream than reality. The electronic score by Tangerine Dream adds an otherworldly pulse, music that makes the entire film feel like you're watching someone else's nightmare. Production, however, was a disaster. A massive fire destroyed sets. Key sequences were unfinished, and studio cuts removed nearly an hour from Mann's intended version. The final film runs barely 90 minutes, But what's left is haunting. Fragments of a masterpiece that somehow feel more powerful in their incompleteness. On cable and VHS, the keep became a cult enigma. Viewers didn't know what they'd just seen, only that it looked and sounded like nothing else. Its horror filtered through poetry and smoke, a reminder that sometimes mystery is scarier than explanation. Evilspeak, 1981. If you ever wondered what would happen if Carrie met the exorcist inside a military academy, Evilspeak has your answer. And it's every bit as strange as it sounds. Released in 1981 and directed by Eric Weston, this movie became infamous on the UK video nasty list for its violence, blasphemy, and buckets of pig's blood. Clint Howard stars as Stanley Coopersmith, a bullied cadet who discovers an ancient satanic text hidden in the Academy's basement chapel. Using a computer to translate the Latin passages, Stanley accidentally resurrects a demonic spirit through digital sorcery, turning technology into a tool of hell. The concept feels ahead of its time, bridging old religion and new machines years before The Lawnmower Man or Pulse. Once the possession starts, Evilspeak goes completely off the rails. Decapitations, telekinetic rampages, and a climax involving demonized pigs that attack the entire academy. It's absurd, shocking, and unforgettable. The gore was so extreme that many scenes were cut for its initial release, only to be restored decades later when the uncut version resurfaced on disc. Despite its rough edges, the film has a strange sincerity. Clint Howard plays it straight, and the tone swings between tragic and chaotic. For horror fans growing up in the VHS era, Evilspeak was that movie you dared your friends to rent. It was banned, bootlegged, and whispered about, which only made it more appealing. Even today, it stands as a time capsule of 80s rebellion, the story of one kid who finally got even. With a little help from Satan and a Commodore computer. The Unholy, 1988. The Unholy feels like the ultimate late-night discovery. One of those strange titles you'd rent because the box promised sin, demons, and glowing red eyes. Directed by Camilo Villa, it's part possession horror, part surreal religious nightmare. The story follows Father Michael, played by Ben Cross, a priest assigned to a New Orleans parish, where his predecessor was violently murdered at the altar. Locals whisper about a demonic seductress haunting the area, an entity that takes human form to tempt holy men into ruin. The film's opening scene wastes no time showing how deadly that temptation can be, setting the tone for everything that follows. Villa's direction leans heavily on atmosphere. The church is drenched in red and green light, full of fog, mirrors, and unholy symbolism. The final act goes full creature feature, with a massive puppet demon created by effects artist Bob Keane, who just worked on Hellraiser. The design was so ambitious that much of the mechanical creature had to be filmed in pieces, giving it an almost otherworldly motion. Ben Cross plays it straight, grounding the story as madness builds around him, while Trevor Howard and Hal Holbrook add gravitas in smaller supporting roles. Critics weren't sure what to make of it. Too strange to be mainstream, too slick to be forgotten. On VHS, though, The Unholy found its congregation. Viewers loved its mix of faith, flesh, and fever dream imagery. It's messy, ambitious, and impossible to look away from. A movie that turns theology into pure nightmare fuel. The Seventh Curse, 1986. Hong Kong cinema in the 80s had no limits, and The Seventh Curse might be its most delirious example of supernatural horror mayhem. Released in 1986 and directed by Lam Ngai Kai, who'd later make Ricky-O, The Story of Ricky, this one throws martial arts, curses, gore, and Indiana Jones-style adventure into a blender and hits pure chaos. The film stars Chow Yun-fat as a pipe-smoking, machine-gun-wielding adventurer helping a cursed doctor, Chin Siu Ho, battle an ancient tribe in the jungles of Thailand. The curse in question: a series of internal blood explosions that can only be stopped by defeating a ghostly goddess and her skeletal baby monster. Yes, really. What makes The Seventh Curse stand out isn't just its energy. It's how fearlessly it mixes tones. One minute it's slapstick comedy. The next, it's spraying blood like Evil Dead 2. Practical effects dominate: rubber creatures, exploding torsos, stop-motion skeletons, and one of the most bizarre giant monsters ever to appear in a horror film. The movie was a big hit in Asia, but gained a second life internationally. Western fans, discovering it decades later, couldn't believe what they were seeing: a horror film where the solution to demonic possession might be a roundhouse kick. The Seventh Curse is pure midnight movie gold: fast, funny, bloody, and totally unhinged. It doesn't just cross genres, it vaporizes them. If you want a reminder of how wild 80s horror could be when nobody cared about rules, this one delivers in glorious, chaotic fashion. Witchboard, 1986. Few 80s horror movies capture the occult meets party energy quite like Witchboard. Released in 1986 and directed by Kevin Tenney, it takes a simple premise: a Ouija board that opens a door to the spirit world and turns it into a weirdly stylish, surprisingly emotional supernatural thriller. The story follows Linda, played by Tawny Kitaen, whose curiosity with a spirit board at a house party goes sideways when she begins communicating with a ghost named David. At first, the messages seem harmless, even comforting, but as the contact deepens, a darker presence slips through. One that isn't David at all. What follows is a slow spiral into possession, murder, and paranoia, wrapped in pastel lighting and 80s fashion so bright it almost hurts. Tenney wrote and directed the film after years of hearing urban legends about Ouija boards causing real hauntings, and he took it seriously. There's no tongue-in-cheek irony here. The tone walks that perfect 80s line between melodrama and menace. The effects are practical and smartly restrained, relying on moving objects, cold drafts, and the idea that something unseen is watching. When Witchboard hit VHS, it became a massive rental hit, especially with teenage audiences. It was just supernatural enough to feel dangerous, but polished enough for repeat viewing. The movie spawned two sequels: Witchboard 2, The Devil's Doorway, and Witchboard 3, The Possession. But the original still holds the most charm. Part ghost story, part romantic tragedy, Witchboard sits in that perfect 80s pocket where horror didn't need to explain itself. It just needed atmosphere, mystery, and a few good scares to make you think twice about ever touching a Ouija board again. The Outing, 1987. When a group of teens sneaks into a museum after hours, they stumble across an ancient lamp that holds a deadly secret. Instead of wishes, it unleashes a vengeful genie, a supernatural force that preys on their fears and turns the museum into a trap filled with blood, shadows, and strange illusions. Directed by Tom Daly, The Outing, also released as The Lamp, is a supernatural slasher that fuses Middle Eastern mythology with classic 80s teen horror. The young cast includes Andra Saint-Ivany as Alex, the lead caught in the genie's curse, while Deborah Winters and James Houston provide the adult anchors as the archaeologists tied to the artifact's discovery. The museum setting is the film's biggest strength. Glass cases, stuffed animals, and eerie artifacts become backdrops for supernatural attacks. From spear impalements to ghostly visions, the kills lean into creativity, giving each death a bizarre, mystical flavor. The genie itself, brought to life with practical effects, shifts between unseen menace and full-on creature reveal, delivering both atmosphere and monster movie thrills. While the pacing can be uneven, the moments of surreal violence keep the energy high. What gives The Outing its cult status is the mix of familiar 80s slasher beats with an unusual villain. It's not another masked killer. It's a supernatural entity that turns curiosity into punishment. Though overlooked on release, The Outing carved its place in VHS-era horror as a one-of-a-kind oddity, remembered for its unique premise and wild creature effects. From cursed objects and occult rituals to psychic soldiers and winged demons, 80s supernatural horror was a playground for imagination. These films might have been forgotten in the streaming age, but on home video they were magic, colorful, creepy, and completely unique. Which of these possessed 80s gems stood out to you most? Drop it in the comments. And if there's one we missed, let us know for a future volume. And if you want to support the channel and get early access, exclusive polls, and behind-the-scenes extras, consider joining the Eject Media membership. It helps keep the archive alive and growing. Hit like, subscribe, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.